Okay, this is a very exciting video because we're going to be taking those really obnoxious and intolerable behaviors that your dog is doing, and we're going to be talking about how to stop those behaviors. We're going to be talking about quadrants, and we're going to be talking about corrections. The quadrants, what the heck is that? The quadrants refers to the operant conditioning learning theory model. Bleh, that's a lot of words. What it basically is it's a concept of how dogs and people and animals learn. So it's not an idea that someone invented. It's not like maybe this is how we could teach dogs how to learn. It's based more on observation. So it's an actual factual thing that exists in the world and exists in dog psychology, that actually it's just a real thing. I want to emphasize that. It's not an invention that someone just came up with. They just made the model for it. So we're talking about operant conditioning, which is just one of these models. There's plenty of models, and some of them are more similar to inventions, or just like they're just made up, and some of them are actually more based on observations. This one is very good, very important, and you don't need to memorize it. This is just for concept for you, because my goal is to get you thinking independently about how your behavior is impacting your dog's behavior. And I think this particular model I like to focus on because it's so relevant to how your behavior is impacting your dog's behavior. So operant conditioning is pretty complex. You can see in this chart, there's this flow chart, it's not really a flow chart, but it's segmented into lots of different categories. And a really good dog trainer understands all these categories and can work with all of them, because that's, to me, what makes a really good dog trainer is they understand dog psychology, and they're doing everything they can to get the dog to understand new concepts, to make it easier for you, make it easier for the dog, so you can reach your goals and live a harmonious life with your dog. So this is a pretty complex model, but why we call it the 4 quadrants of learning is because it can be summarized in this simpler model. So here's the model of the 4 quadrants, and let me explain what the 4 quadrants are. So you can see along one side, it talks about positive and negative. Those are not moral judgments. It's not like good and bad, or like feels good, feels bad. Positive and negative means, for positive, you add something to the scenario, and for negative, you remove something from the scenario. Scenario. Some people say scenario. I get picked on for that. Anyway, whatever. So positive means you add, negative means you remove. That's important. Reinforcement means it's likely to it increases the likelihood of the dog repeating that behavior. So reinforcement means you're trying to get the dog to do the same thing again. Punishment means you're trying to decrease the likelihood of that behavior. So you're trying to get your dog to stop doing that behavior. So let's do a quick example of each. I will give you an example of each quadrant. One example is going to be from a human intervention perspective, so what people do that falls into each of these quadrants. And the other example I'm going to give is from the environment, because like I said earlier, this is an observation of how dogs learn. It's not a theory about how we could teach dogs stuff. And so dogs are learning from their environment constantly. They're not just learning like in the classroom with you, right? They're learning about how the world works from the actual world. So I wanted to give some examples of what that is, because that also plays a part in your dog's behavior modification, because you're in competition with the environment a lot of the time. So positive reinforcement, let's talk about this quadrant first. Pretty obvious example of a human intervention is to give your dog a treat, right? So you give them, you add something, you add the treat in order to increase the likelihood of them doing that behavior again. From the environment, positive reinforcement might be eating animal poop. because it tastes good. So they're, not to me, it tastes good to your dog. And they are more likely to look for poop, or to like hunt for poop, or to try to eat it if they get to eat it because of the flavor. Positive reinforcement, isn't that disgusting? So positive punishment. This is an example, would be like doing a pop on a training collar. I'm going to demo later in the video how to do that. But basically, it's if your dog is doing something you don't want them to do and you do a correction with the training collar. That would be positive punishment. From the environment, a bite on the nose from a gopher. So if your dog is hunting gophers, the gopher wants to add something to the equation to discourage your dog from hunting it. So it's gonna, if your dog puts its nose in the gopher hole, it's gonna bite it. I've seen that. Pictures. So the gopher is trying to discourage the hunting. Negative punishment. So an example of this is taking away a bone. So if the dog growls at you and you take the bone away, you're taking away something from the equation to, or from the scenario to discourage the growling. An example from the environment would be a squirrel hiding. So if your dog is chasing the squirrel wants to discourage the chasing. I mean, it also wants to save its own life, but just from, this is how it works in your dog's mind. So the squirrel wants to stop the chasing, and so it'll hide, and that is taking itself away to discourage the chase. Negative reinforcement. So this one is really, really cool, and we're going to use it in the training too, just because it's so cool and can be so effective. One example is if you're teaching your dog, or if your dog knows how to sit and they're just not doing it, and you pull tight on the leash and you hold it there, as soon as their butt hits the ground, you slack the leash, so you take the pressure off. So right when that moment when you slacken the leash, that's the example of the negative reinforcement, because you want to reinforce them sitting when you say sit, and slacking the leash, you're taking something out of the scenario, right? An example from the environment. Say your dog is frightened by the mailman, and when they bark at the front door, the mailman naturally, because they're delivering mail, they walk away because they put the mail there and now they're leaving. However, your dog sees this as a negative reinforcement. So they think they got the scary mailman to go away, right? So removing the object of fear, removing that reinforces the barking in that example. So I want to really emphasize that. So that's quick examples of all four quadrants, and I want to really emphasize that dogs learn in all four quadrants, whether we like it or not. They're learning from the environment, and they're even learning from our own natural or intuitive behaviors. And they're just always learning. They're like little sponges. So dogs learn in all four quadrants. I want you to now take a second to think about your behavior and how it fits into these four quadrants. I made an exercise, a handout. So in a second, I want you to pause the video, go look at the handout, and do the exercise. There's an answer key with it, so don't just go to the answer key. Try to do the questionnaire part first and then look at the answer key. And if you learn something new, go ahead and put it into the Facebook group. Or if you thought it was totally dumb, go ahead and put it into the Facebook group, because I want to hear about it. And I want to, let's just chat about it, because it's something that is naturally happening anyway, and I just want you to have an awareness of it. I don't need you to memorize the quadrants. We're not going to refer back to this later in the training, unless you're like a learning theory nerd, and then of course we can talk about it. I love talking about it, but it's just for you to get a concept of it. It's just an exercise for you to think about how your behavior is actually training your dog, whether you like it or not. So pause the video now, go ahead and do the exercise, and then come back to this in a second. I'm going to pause too. Okay, how did you do on the thing, the handout? If you learned anything new or whatever, maybe, yeah, or if you have any thoughts on it, I'd love to hear about them in the Facebook group. There's a dog whining in the background, so you might actually get to see a real life example of a correction here, present moment. Cool. I'm going to ignore it first. We'll see if that stops it. They're just excited that now I'm talking. So I was saying before the break that dogs learn in all 4 quadrants. So I want to talk about that a little bit because there are some people who say that positive reinforcement is the only acceptable quadrant. However, not only is that just wrong because dogs learn in all 4 quadrants, I have a lot of opinions about that. So one opinion I have is that the people who say that are moral. No. That's what it can look like. It doesn't have to be violent or crazy. That was a correction. That counts. And what I'm going to do next is see if it changes the dog's behavior. And I might go over there. Okay, I'll keep you in the loop. So, people who say that positive reinforcement is the only acceptable quadrant to work in, they're moralizing something that's just not true. They're putting their human ethics on something that is not, to me, not an ethical question. How you use the 4 quadrants, to me, is the ethical question, but whether or not to use punishment at all or negative reinforcement is, to me, not the question, because I want your dog to actually learn from you. I don't want you to be stuck in one quadrant that's not going to bring you success. Also, these trainers a lot of times are not even actually aware that they're actually using all 4 quadrants. So I've spoken with someone in the past who they worked with purely positive trainers, and I asked them, what happened, what was their suggestion for XYZ behavior, and they were like, oh, the trainer said to do a tug on the leash. It's like, okay, well, that's positive punishment. So if you're a positive reinforcement trainer and you don't use punishment, like, actually that's punishment. And it's not just that one trainer, it's across the board, because it's a moral judgment. It's like an ignorance of the actual theory. And like we saw earlier, it can be confusing, right? When negative means removing something, it's not a moral judgment. It doesn't mean it feels bad. So it can be confusing, but like if you're gonna moralize something, you should at least understand what you're moralizing or like what you're even talking about. So a lot of times people use the terminology incorrectly. So that's one of my pet peeves, just because it is so misunderstood and there is so much like propaganda and hype about positive reinforcement only. And so to me, using the word positive punishment accurately is really important. And also it's a life and death issue. So my experience with positive reinforcement only training is the behavior persists, and not all the time. Some dogs and some behaviors you can certainly use positive reinforcement only, and if that's working, then like I'm all about that. I'm not against positive reinforcement at all. But if that's the only quadrant you're going to work in, then what happens is the behavior tends to persist, tends to get worse a lot of the time. And if you're not going to use any corrections, then a lot of the times those dogs have to be given up / euthanized, like straight up, to be honest. Like if people put them on Prozac. So you'll see a lot of behaviorists who recommend Prozac, but they won't recommend using corrections, which to me, it just shows a lack of hands-on experience working with dogs, to be honest. So I have a lot of opinions about this. I have a lot of experience with this, and I could go on and on, but I just want to give you kind of a background a little bit of a background on the whole argument that positive reinforcement is the only thing that you should use, because I totally disagree with that. I acknowledge and I attempt to perfect my use of all 4 quadrants in the most humane methods possible, with the most efficient results, with the least amount of stress, with the most amount of fun, and the least amount of fallout. And those are my goals. And I've been around the block on all aspects of it. And so I've seen what works, I've seen what doesn't work, and constantly always experimenting. And so that's my goal as a balance trainer in the use of the 4 quadrants. How to balance this out varies dog to dog. So I'm sorry, but I have to tell you that it's all an experiment. That's the secret to dog training. So my role is I've seen a lot, I've done a lot, so I have a lot of experience. So your experimentation will go a lot faster, a lot easier based on my experience, but it is still experimentation. So you have to be open to it. I can't just give you cut and dry answers, because all dogs are different and all dogs have different opinions about different things. And there's no way, with my experience, I can somewhat predict what's going to be successful for certain dogs, but the real test is we have to try it out. So I want to talk a little bit now about tools and methods for corrections. So now we're going to get into corrections. The most important tool and method is your presence. So if you, I need you, or what you should focus on first is taking control of a situation, being the leader. Like, that can be your motto, be the leader. Take control of the situation, be the leader, and that is going to get you 80% of the way there. It's really, really hard to do. It's really tough to do because it requires a lot of confidence in yourself. It requires a lot of confidence in your method. And a lot of times we lack that in lots of parts of our lives. So if it's really hard for you to set boundaries in certain, like at work, for example, then that's something to work on if possible, because it's going to affect how well you set boundaries with your dog and vice versa. So if you get better at setting boundaries with your dog, then hopefully you'll get better at setting boundaries in the rest of your life as well. This is all a journey. It's all a personal growth journey. So when we're talking about tools and methods, your main tool that you have is yourself and your presence. So keep that in mind, because I don't want to just say that it's like the tools are not the end all be all. The main thing that we want is your presence. So like earlier when I said no to the dog who's off camera, yeah, he hasn't relaxed, but he's at least not whining. So that's good. He's just standing and looking around. Anyway, so when I said no to the dog off camera, I had a certain tone, a certain presence, and that's something that I've cultivated over time that serves me more than any physical or other type of tool correction. So yeah, I just want to encourage you all to cultivate that inner strength. As far as actual tools, so there's an infinite number of actual tools and methods for delivering corrections. And if you look at an old training book from like the 70s or 40s, there's some really ugly stuff that people used to recommend and used to do, still do in lots of circles. No, stop it. My goal is part of my job with you is I'm going to recommend tools that to me are the most effective and the most humane. Because just go check it out. Like if you go to the library and just skim an old training manual, they're pretty foul. So I get why the positive reinforcement people are so on their high horse about why corrections are so bad. But they're living in like the 1940s, so whatever, this is 2018. So there's an infinite number of methods. I have 2 favorite methods that I use. I'll say 3. I'll say there's 3 methods. So as far as like physical tools, One thing I use a lot, or one thing I recommend trying, is pet corrector spray. So it comes in a little red bottle. I actually have a little bike pump with a CO2 canister on it. That's what I use at work, just because the red bottle can be expensive and I'm going to use it for a long time. But you can pick up the red bottle. That's totally fine because you hopefully won't be using it for very long. And how the pet corrector spray works, I'll get into that in a minute when I talk about timing, but that's just one thing that I would say. Go grab one of those cans from the pet store or online, and that's one of my favorite methods for corrections. Another method we're going to be using a lot is the leash. So I have a leash here. I'll show you how to do the corrections in a minute, but that's just one thing that I find works really well. I always have the leash in my hand most of the time, so I can use it really easily. Yeah, so it's a really good tool. So the third method that I use a lot is social pressure. So this is where you, so the dog, now he's laying on a bed. Isn't that so nice? He stopped whining and he finally relaxed himself. So for the dog who was whining in the background, this is what I would probably try first with him because he's a pretty sensitive dog. Basically what social pressure is like that looming personality that you can take on. So you say no, you kind of loom a little bit. It's like you put pressure on the dog, and then when they comply, you relax the pressure. So I do use this, but something to keep in mind also with all of this stuff is like try to leave your ego out of it, which sometimes can be hard because it's like we're putting in so much effort and so much time, and it can be so frustrating when our dogs are just like not following through with what we're asking. So when you use social pressure, do it in a way that's not like leave your ego out of it. Like don't overuse it, or any of these corrections, don't overuse them. The reason for that is because I don't want, like, your ego being wrapped up in a correction is going to affect your relationship with your dog. The correction is not the thing that's gonna, I mean, it could, but the correction is not the thing I'm worried about affecting your dog. It's how you, what the correction is for you. If it's coming from a place of frustration or, anything like that, or like a desire to control the situation, just to control it from an egotistical point of view, that's going to be not so great for your relationship. But if it's coming from a place of just like a matter of fact delivery of correction, a matter of fact of like, I'm the leader, you need to stop doing that, okay, we're going to make you stop doing it, done, problem solved, then that's a better place to come from. The reason is, or one of the reasons for that is because if your ego is wrapped up into it, it's a lot easier to overcorrect. But if you're just being in a neutral attitude, then and it's like just this is how it is, because that's how dog leaders act. That's their attitude. They correct the situation and then they move on. They're not hung up on it. That's the dogs who are like very secure leaders that the other dogs respect. So the more we can mimic that attitude, the easier it's going to be for us. Similar topic. So we talked in the cause and effect video about feedback being compelling. So this applies to food. So like if you're trying to give your dog kibble as a reward, it might not be that compelling as if you give them cheese as a reward, for example. So same thing with punishment. The dog who was whining in the background, the correction I gave, the positive punishment when I said no, and I gave him kind of a little bit of a stare too, that punishment matched the crime, right? If he was persisted in whining or it was escalating and he was getting into barking, then what I was going to do is change my punishment level. I was going to get up and go over there and maybe even use the leash to put him on the bed. And that in that way, I'm assessing the crime, and then I'm adjusting my punishment for the crime. So the only way that you can tell if, let me see, I'm referring to my notes here. So the only way to tell if your feedback, your correction is compelling for your dog is you need to ask, how is it affecting their behavior? So there's a few things that can come up here. Your dog might just respond really nicely, and they might just go and lay down and look, or whatever the result you're looking for, and be relaxed, and then that's it, and that's great. They might be a little confused. To me, this is okay. A little bit of confusion is fine. I'm not worried about that. If they're just like kind of reserved and like not really sure, I'm totally okay with that, because that means that they're thinking. So that means you're getting into their head, and they're thinking like, what am I supposed to be doing different? So they are actually giving a crap about your opinion. So to me, for most dogs who are like too no, none of those words are right, the words that are coming to me. They're too flamboyant, we'll use that word. They have too much personality, they're too much running the show and not really caring about your opinion. If they look a little confused when you're doing corrections, like, chill. I am totally fine with that. A little bit of avoidance too. So a little bit of that I'm also okay with. So like, for example, dogs who have sketchy relationships with other dogs, or like don't greet very well, when we're working on that, if you start correcting your dog for whatever behaviors with the other dogs, of course this will be covered as appropriate in later videos. This is not the whole explanation of how to do this, of course, but just as an example of avoidance, if your dog is usually like too into other dogs, too much wanting to greet, and you start training on that, and then they see a dog and they're like, I don't really want to deal with that. That's avoidance, and I'm okay with that, because we can work with that. Because what it means is that your dog is actually thinking, and it's actually taking your feedback. One thing I would, if your dog keeps doing the same behavior, you know that your correction isn't working. So that either means that you need to do it more firmly. It might also mean we need to change the type of correction you're doing. It might mean that that's another way your dog is confused. So there's a lot that can come up. So just my job is to help you figure all this stuff out, and I don't want you to be nervous about doing corrections. I just want you to be observant, and go ahead and take bunches of videos, send them to me, put them in the Facebook group, ask questions. Videos are going to be the number one best way to troubleshoot this or workshop this. And yeah, the only way, because I need to read your dog's body language, because I'm going to see stuff that's different than what you're going to see just because of my experience. And so your job is to observe your dog, notice what happens after you do the correction with them. Don't get freaked out. If they look confused, don't be freaked out like you ruined them or anything like that. I'm sure that's not the case. Communicate with me. Be in constant communication with me. So, since we're talking about body language, I want to mention a book that I would really, really, really recommend. So this book is incredible. Hopefully it's not backwards when you're reading it. Anyway, this book is incredible. Canine Body Language. Native Language of Domestic Dogs. It has millions and millions of photos in it. Big photos. If you are not confident in reading your dog's body language, I would recommend or even if you are confident, I would recommend picking up this book. It's not very expensive on Amazon. It's like $30 or something. And it's like a big fat textbook. Because it's really cool to see all the different things, all the different ways dogs communicate their feelings and their intentions. I really recommend it. And it will help you with your interventions with your dog's behavior. And it'll help show you, or it'll help you understand actually your dog is thinking in response to your communications with them. So there's a spectrum of responses from your dog, and some of them I already covered. So one end of the spectrum is that your correction actually is encouraging the behavior. So obviously we want to avoid this one because we're correcting your dog because we want to stop that behavior. But on one end of the spectrum, the correction is going to encourage the behavior, and that's a miscommunication that you guys are having. In the middle, your dog is responding appropriately. This is like maybe not as efficient response. This is like exactly where I would want you to be. Like the perfect correction for the perfect, to correct that perfect behavior. And then you get more into like the avoidance stuff, and then you get more into superstitions. So dogs are very superstitious just naturally because they don't speak English, and some dogs are way more superstitious than others. So if your dog is very confused and the correction makes no sense to them, then they're going to develop some superstition. And that's I want to avoid that as much as possible. And then we're going to talk about how to avoid that. And like I said, it's okay for your dog to be kind of pouty or confused in there. Yeah, it is okay. It is okay. So something that's really important about the punishment, delivering a correction, is I want you to use a marker, a verbal marker, before you do the punishment, before you do the correction. So the word we're going to use is no. Practice saying it with me. It should be short. It should be to the point. It should be matter of fact. It should just be like, no, you're not going to do that. Like, period. Like, it's not a question. It's not a suggestion. It's just like, nope, no, no. Yeah, practice saying it. Let's do it now. So your dog's being a nut. What are you going to say? You're going to say no. No. Seems really silly to practice it, but it's really can be a big deal. And that is the thing that has to be well timed. So when your dog is doing the thing that you don't want them to do, you say no. Then within 30 seconds of that is when you deliver the correction. So a lot of the time you can just say no, and that will be enough. Like you saw with the whining dog, right? I didn't even get up. I said no, and that was plenty. So if that works, then just leave it at that. You don't have to do anything else. However, if that doesn't work, or if your dog doesn't really understand the value of the word no, then you're going to need to deliver a correction within 30 seconds. So it's better to get situated, like find your pet corrector spray, put your leash in your a good correction, and say no, and then get situated and then do the correction. That's better than to just say no and do like a sloppy correction. It's just less efficient. You have to do it more times. Your dog, it doesn't deliver the same meaning to your dog. Your dog doesn't respect the word no as much. So it's totally okay if you need to like get situated to do the correction. Just make sure it definitely is happening within 30 seconds. Sooner is better, obviously, but you have like up to 30 seconds based on studies of how dogs learn in this method. So the order of operations: you witness the thing that you want to change, you say no, and then you do the correction within 30 seconds. Because where I want you to get to is the point where you verbally say no and your dog changes their behavior without having to do all this rigmarole. So you'll notice in there, I got a truck going by outside. Yeah. And it's better for the correction to be appropriate to the crime and slightly later, rather than not appropriate to the crime and really fast. And that also gives you the headspace to not be frantic. Because like I was saying earlier, you're just like a calm leader. It's very matter of fact. So if you say like say your dog's barking in the crate and you say no, and you go to like get the pet corrector spray and you're like running over there to like do it so fast, like that is not calm leader personality type, right? So what I want you to do instead is, you know, you have 30 seconds to get there. Okay, say no, walk over to the pet corrector spray, pick it up, walk over to the dog, use it, okay? You don't have to be like flipping out. The more important thing, like I said, is your presence, your confidence, your leadership attitude. So let's talk about some classic corrections that I would recommend. So one, I was just alluding to this, barking in the crate. It's best for any type of correction, it's best to catch it early, and then you don't have to do as strong of a correction most of the time, and it takes out your dog being like super hyper frantic. So for barking in the crate, if your dog is just starting to escalate their excitement, then that's the perfect time to do it, is when they just start doing it. So like for the whining, I said they just started whining. If I let them continue whining, it might be where they settle down and just lay down without me intervening. It might be also that they get themselves more worked up, and then they're in the realm of barking. So it's best for barking in the crate to catch it early. And the method I would use is if your dog is really, what is the word I'm thinking of? I keep wanting to say flamboyant, and I'm pretty sure that's not the right word. Boisterous, maybe? If your dog is very boisterous, I don't know why it's not coming to me. Anyway, so some dogs are really sensitive. I'll just go the opposite way. Some dogs are really sensitive, and you say no, and you go to the crate and you use that social pressure, you stand over them, and then they stop. Some dogs see that as a reward. Like, oh, I summoned you to interact with me. So you're gonna have to read how your dog responds. So that's for really sensitive dogs, that's what I'll do. I'll say no, and I'll kind of loom over them. For dogs who are more boisterous, then I will use the pet corrector spray. So, or dogs who are just like frenzied barking, catching it early and using the pet corrector spray. So I'll say no, I'll get the pet corrector spray, have it on you already is even better. And then I spray, so like here's the crate door, and I spray right in the crate door. So I'm gonna say no and spray right in the crate door. Similar method for reactivity on the walk. So if your dog is really reactive, or not really reactive, if your dog has some reactivity on the walk to like people or dogs coming by, there's a lot of methods to work on this. And the first thing I want you to try is bring the pet corrector spray with you, you know, keep it in your pocket or whatever. Say no. If once your dog starts getting like agitated, say no, and then spray them right on the top of the head. Just one quick little spray. Try that. A lot with most dogs who aren't very committed to being reactive or aggressive, that's gonna work fine. It's just like a quick little spritz on the top of the head, and then they're gonna be like, oh, I'm not supposed to do that. And so that is that's how I would start with that. And there's, that's reactivity on the walk can be really, really tough, and it can be something that we need to work on in a different way, but start with that suggestion. Another classic, like simple correction that I would recommend for you guys is that you're probably experiencing at this point, or could be experiencing at this point, is whining on the tie down. So that's what the dog was doing off camera in the beginning of the video. He's on tie down and he was whining a little bit. That's basically him just saying like, I don't like it. Can you come do something for me? And I'm like, yeah, you know what I can do for you? I can tell you no, and I can give you a correction, because I don't want to deal with that, because it will escalate. It's also just a bad habit, and it stresses them out. They're not relaxed when they're whining, but he's asleep right now. So now he's relaxed. I would say he's relaxed. So for whining on the tie down, I would do it a little differently than the pet corrector, because it's not as egregious as barking in the crate, right? Barking in the crate is like so obnoxious and must stop. Whining on the tie down is like they're hinting that they're gonna start barking. So the way I would do this is with a pop on the training leash. Yeah. So here's a training collar. It's a little pokey. This is the good dog collar or the star mark collar. And the way I would deal with this, how to do a pop on the leash, is you're gonna say no first, and then it's a quick little pop on the leash. You'll see that it's not a tug, right? That would be more like a tug. And the difference is the pressure on the leash is released pretty much as soon as it goes on. So it's like this. Does that make sense? If you aren't comfortable with this, what I would recommend is putting this on yourself and practicing. You want it to just be like a quick little sensation. You can also put it on your leg or your calf or whatever, or you can roll up a towel and put the collar on the towel and practice that. You just want it to be a quick little pop on the leash. So pops on the leash, yeah, in our obedience training, we're going to be using pops on the leash a bit more. We're also going to be using the method where you hold the pressure and then release the pressure. If you remember from the beginning of the video, this releasing the pressure is called negative reinforcement. So we're going to be using that too. But just for the purpose of whining on the tie down, I want you to just do a little pop. So their tie down will be attached to their flat collar, like the actual clip, and then put another leash attached to the training collar. Does that make sense? Because I don't want the tie down attached to their training collar. Just attach the tie down to their flat collar. The exception to that is if your dog is like crazy, like lunging off of the tie down, in which case then I do attach the tie down to the training collar. But just if you're not sure, attach it to the flat collar, take a video, I'll give you a recommendation, right? That's how we do this. You don't need, there's a lot of different guesswork in training, but you actually don't need to do that because you hired me as your trainer. So all you have to do is ask me. You just have to experiment and ask me. Okay. So with the pop on the leash, I explained how to do it for whining. Something else to keep in mind is we can sometimes use pops on the leash. They're like incidental pops on the leash. So an example of that is when we first start working on leash manners, we're going to be doing 180s. So you're walking together. Okay, your dog starts cruising ahead and you're going to do a 180. Eventually, they're going to hit the end of the leash, right? And it's going to do a pop. That's like an incidental correction. And then what happens is your dog is going to be like, oh, what the heck? And they're going to turn and walk with you. Then they're probably going to cruise ahead again. And so they're cruising and you turn around and then pop on the leash, right? We can use those to our advantage by saying a word ahead of the pop. Or in that case, it's actually not a word, it's a body language cue. So the body language cue is you're turning away, and then that's the cue that they're going to be looking for to avoid that pop in the future. You don't have to worry about that conceptually, but I just wanted to point out that corrections come from the environment. They also come incidentally just because we're holding a leash, and we can use them to our advantage. So using the leash not to your advantage would be if your dog is ahead of you and they're getting the correction on the leash, but you're just continuing walking ahead. That's not using it to your advantage. Actually, what that is doing is teaching your dog to not pay attention to the pops on the leash. However, if your dog is going to catch the leash and you turn away, you're using that to your advantage because you're teaching them to pay attention to you. So it's little stuff like that that is going to really help how effective the corrections are, how they fit into your life. Yeah, they can be really, really, really cool. So to wrap up this video, I want to talk again about positive reinforcement because like I said, I love positive reinforcement. It's what I use most of the time. We don't use corrections for teaching new words, like teaching your dog to sit. I'm not going to correct them into a sit. I could. A lot of trainers do. I used to at a place that I used to work a long time ago. However, I don't want to do that way. I want to use the positive reinforcement to get them learning the behaviors, get them motivated, get them happy. And then when they know the behavior, we're going to start introducing really small corrections. And then if they are really, really blowing you off and it's a really big deal, then we'll use bigger corrections. But we're not going to use corrections for learning certain behaviors. We're going to use corrections for cutting out certain behaviors, like the whining, like the demanding behaviors, and the like bad behaviors. But we're mostly going to be using positive reinforcement for teaching new behaviors. And sometimes it's a combination. So like, for example, jumping on you. Sometimes we're going to be correcting for the jumping, but we also want to be giving them something else to do. So we're going to be working a lot on holding sits. We're going to be working a lot on holding downs so that when your dog has a really solid sit or a really solid down with lots of distractions, then you are just another distraction, or the new person is just another distraction. So we work on it with the positive reinforcement, with the sitting, and then when we introduce the distraction, we might use some corrections with that. So using both is really, really effective, and that's why I'm saying all 4 quadrants. That's why I'm really into all 4 quadrants, because you can use them together in combination to get to your goals in a really fast way. And not just fast, but in a way that is your dog understands really well, because they understand in all 4 quadrants. They learn in all 4 quadrants. So you can also use positive reinforcement just throughout your day. So like if your dog is relaxing on tie down, toss them a couple treats, right? I'm all about that. If your dog is walking really nicely next to you, give them some verbal praise. Tell them how much you love how much they're walking next to you. Petting is you can use pets as well. It can be, that's one that especially usually gets the dog excited. So like if your dog is on tie down and you go to pet them to reward them for relaxing on tie down, that's probably going to get them excited. You'll just have to feel it out, test it out, experiment. But in general, like, if a dog's on tie down, I'll toss them a couple treats. You just have to be aware how your positive reinforcement is maybe not matching the situation, if it's getting your dog really hyped up. But otherwise, go ahead and use it, give them treats for just chilling out. If they're just laying down next to you, you can put a few treats on the ground. That sounds great. If they're walking nice next to you, you can tell them that they're walking nice next to you. I love that. So use all 4 quadrants. Even though this video is really heavily focused on corrections and how to do corrections, I want you to use all 4 quadrants. Because that's how dogs learn. That's how your dog's gonna learn. So take videos. If you have questions from this, post them in the Facebook group, and let's get to the point where you're cutting out those behaviors that are just totally ridiculous. And if you're not sure which behaviors and what to use with what, post a question in the Facebook group. But I think this video should give you a really good starting point to work from.